and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Well, a question that many could ask is why the United States has just rewarded the CIA's George Tenet Medal to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef. This is the same Saudi Arabia which has been accused of supporting Daesh and is the bed of Takfiri extremists and has killed more than 11,000 Yemenis in its bombardment and siege of the poor Arab country. Will stay with us as we take a look at this latest situation right here on this debate.
The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency has awarded its George Tenet Medal to Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef for what the agency described as his intelligence work in the fight against terrorism. Nayef received the medal from CIA Chief Michael Pompeo during a ceremony in Riyadh. The Saudi Crown Prince said ties between his country and the United States are strategic and historic. He stressed the award shows Washington's recognition of what he called Riyadh's anti-terrorism efforts. This is while Saudi Arabia stands accused of arming and financially supporting terror groups in Syria.
The terrorism in the world today is almost completely the product of major national governments, beginning with the U.S. and Israeli governments, and the Saudi government pretty much is up there too in the top three. The Saudis are the ones who are funding all of the Wahhabi terrorism, the Takfiri terrorism, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and so on. That's all supported by the U.S. and Israel, but it's all coming out of Saudi Arabia. So giving them a medal for fighting terrorism is enough to make you not know whether to laugh or cry.
The CIA move comes several months after relations between Washington and Riyadh strained over a U.S. law on September 11 attacks in 2001. Riyadh was outraged at the law for allowing the families of the victims to sue the Saudi government because 15 of the 19 men who carried out the attacks were Saudi nationals. Yet Saudi Arabia is excluded from Trump's travel ban, which prohibited citizens of 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the U.S. over what he called terror threats. This is while none of the target countries, namely Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Sudan, and Syria, have been involved in a terror incident on U.S. soil. At the same time, American media reports have cited business interests of Trump for excluding countries like Saudi Arabia from his travel ban list. Meanwhile, the US is also accused of backing Saudi Arabia's destabilizing actions and its war on Yemen, where thousands of civilians have fallen victim to daily airstrikes.
They're also helping out with the terrorism against Yemen as well. The Americans have advisors in Saudi Arabia. They're providing equipment to the Saudis to mass murder innocent civilians in Yemen. And of course, that's the definition of terrorism, is attacking civilians for political purposes.
Less than a month into office, the Trump administration has failed to offer a clear foreign policy agenda, including on terrorism. On one side, it speaks of fighting Daesh and blames the previous administration for helping the terrorist groups rise. On the other, the Trump administration praises the Saudi kingdom that is widely accused of sponsoring terrorism, an issue that has now turned into a global threat following a series of terror attacks that struck different countries, including in Europe.
Okay, well, I'd like to welcome my guest to the program. Former American intelligence linguist, Mr. Scott Ricard out of Tampa. And from the Security Studies Program, MIT, Mr. Jim Walsh out of Boston. Thank you both for being with us. Let's start this off in Boston. In your perspective, Jim Walsh, why would the United States reward Saudi Arabia? Is Saudi Arabia the symbol of human rights, stability, security? What's your take on that?
Well, I assume there are several things going on. First, it's possible, countries are complex and diverse, and often there's a right hand and a left hand that are doing different things. I think the critique that Saudi Arabia supported Wahhabism, and in particular extremist groups, is absolutely a correct critique. That does not prevent Saudi Arabia from also coordinating with the U.S. in intelligence and other areas as part of counterterrorism programming. So I think both things could be true at the same time, that they will, their actions further terrorism in some regards, even as the governments work more closely than they have in the past on counterterrorism. So I accept both. And then I think, obviously, these are two countries that have a friendly relationship, and giving a medal, I don't. It's not big news here in the U.S. I couldn't find a newspaper that was really running the story. But, if that improves U.S.-Saudi relations and with someone who's on a short list to being the leader of Saudi Arabia, then it shouldn't be any surprise. That's what governments do. They give awards and other sorts of things to show their, appreciation. So I don't think it's really that's a really a big deal.
All right. Interesting choice of words, showing appreciation to Saudi Arabia. It's interesting, Mr. Ricard, especially being that the standard line, of course, in the United States in dealing with 9/11 is that the majority of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. And, of course, we know that Saudi Arabia has been supporting terrorism actually in Syria, in the region. And, of course, we know that it is also the center of the Takfiris. Your take on comments made by Mr. Walsh and also what I've just said.
Well, first of all, the facts speak for themselves. Saudi Arabia, a country of, under 30 million people, has a tremendous budget. 25% of their annual GDP goes to military equipment. It's almost $80 billion. And when in comparison, 75 million people, say in Iran, have less than $15 billion on their annual budget for their military defense. So, obviously a country that's about a third of the size of Iran spending at least 4 to 5 times as much on military equipment. I think there's an incredible disparity there that needs to be addressed. At the same time, it's comical the way that Mr. Walsh tries to defend the indefensible around, maybe they do actually supply terrorists, but at the same time they're trying to fight terrorists. So, and obviously that same unfortunate excuse goes to the United States as well. The United States is absolutely funding terrorists and absolutely fighting terrorists. So, there's a tremendous hypocrisy here. Obviously, it's not carried in American newspapers because it's a tremendously a hot topic. It's a hot potato. And nobody wants to be involved with a country that is sponsoring terrorism. And certainly the Americans don't talk about their own sponsorship as well in the American news. So let's be clear here that this is yet again a spin on facts. That's what happens, unfortunately, in the American school systems as well, where Mr. Walsh works, unfortunately. There's a massive amounts of alternative facts being actually taught to our collegiate students, unfortunately.
Okay, what about that, Mr. Walsh, when we see the current situation?
Well, it was a wide-ranging comment, wasn't it?
Well, go ahead. You wanted to comment on his comment? Go ahead.
Sure. It was. Was it good?
Where does one begin? So it's certainly true that Saudi Arabia spends more of has a bigger military budget, and it's the second biggest arms buyer in the market. It and South Korea compete in that way. And Saudi Arabia, which has a lot more money per capita, is spending a lot more money than Iran. I'm not sure what that point was, but yes, that is absolutely true. I don't know what that has to do with counterterrorism.
All the weapons don't end up in Saudi Arabia. The weapons end up as dealerships.
It'd be great if
I was trying to help you.
Interrupting me, right? Just let me talk, and then you can talk all you want. All I want is a chance to respond to your very long statement. So in any case, as he sort of strangely points out, this happens a lot in the real world of international politics. It's true with Saudi Arabia, which has fought terrorism and support terrorism. It's definitely true. The U.S. has supported extremists at different points in Syria, late in the game, but they've done it, or elsewhere during the Cold War, at the same time that they've fought terrorism. Absolutely, again.
They're still doing
also
it.
Iran, Iran is not without hypocrisy here. It has allies that do bad things that it doesn't like. And so, for example, Mr. Assad is a war criminal who has used chemical weapons against his own people and has been condemned by the United Nations and by and all the rest. So international politics, I don't condone it. I support the critique of Saudi Arabia in terms of its support of terrorism. I think it's bad. We should talk about that. The war in Yemen is bad. But let's not pretend that this is hypocrisy only applies in
Mr.
one place.
Walsh, it's interesting. It is very interesting. It is very interesting, sir, and the way you are presenting this, indeed. Let's look at the situation. You mentioned it sort of in passing. It is bad what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. What about that that use of the verbiage that it is bad. More than 11,000 people have been killed, have been bombarded by the Saudi regime and continually being supplied by the British, by the Americans, the same Saudi regime. And now this same Saudi regime actually is being rewarded. Mr. Ricord, what is going on? Does the West support terrorism, encourage terrorism, or is it against terrorism?
Well, I've said this before, the strong will always, unfortunately, take what they want from the weak. The Americans have an incredibly strong military, incredibly strong military-industrial complex. They have incredible financial ties, not only to Saudi Arabia, but Qatar is in the same boat per capita on the kinds of weapons that they buy. Obviously, Kuwait's in the same boat, and Bahrain's in the same boat. So we're talking about an alliance of the petrochemical industries, the military-industrial complex industries, and the banking industries. Obviously, Bahrain is very well known for its financial influences around the world and in the region as well. So this is really a tie between, what has become a tremendously nefarious economic and military operation, and there's no stopping it, unfortunately, because if you slow this down, the American economy is dependent upon it. Why, obviously the American and the European economies are suffering greatly from their tremendous debt that they've incurred, over the past half century. So you have a really difficult situation where you have individuals that are really running the political environments in the United States that are, putting individuals in power like Hillary Clinton or like Donald Trump, and these individuals that are being put in power place around themselves these tremendously influential individuals who are absolutely pro-war, who are absolutely pro-Israel, who are absolutely pro-petroleum. And this is something that is, unfortunately, because it's a steamroller. It's a steamroller that takes advantage of the relationships and causes tremendous destruction in the countries that do not participate in the crimes, both the economic and the military crimes that are being conducted by an alliance.
All right, stay with me, both of my guests, Mr. Ricord and Mr. Walsh. Let's cross over to our Facebook comments and see what our viewers have had to say about this topic.
Well, it's a sick joke, obviously. These two countries have done more to fuel terrorism than all other countries combined. A sick joke indeed. Just like when they gave Tony Blair the role of the Middle East peace envoy. For killing tens of thousands of innocent Yemenis? Why didn't the US ban Saudis? Biggest joke ever, rewarding the terrorist. Trump is turning into a joke. Award for supporting terrorism. Since 1932, the Saudis have collaborated closely with the Americans, to whom they owe their tremendous oil wealth, in funding various Islamic fundamentalist organizations and other American covert operations, particularly the jihad in Afghanistan.
Well, what about that, Mr. Walsh? You heard some of our viewers' comments, basically saying that everything is turning into a joke. And looking at the current administration, they also refer to, of course, we know the 7 countries that the travel ban that has recently been implemented, then suspended. However, curiously enough, of course, Saudi Arabia is not on that list. And here we see, though, that Saudi Arabia, in actuality, is being rewarded by Washington. Your take, sir.
Well, I'm confused by some of the questions and my colleagues' comments. Because, it sort of implies that it's all one thing and all another. And that's not the way the world works. Iran is not the perfect country in the world, and the U.S. is not just Satan and evil, and that's the only two choices. Governments make compromises, engage in hypocrisy, have allies that are unpleasant countries, and that's true in international politics. That's the way the world works. And so the only way to faithfully and authentically respond to that is not through ideology where we have conspiracy theories or, constantly prodding at the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. The way to deal with that is to be honest and critique everything that is bad. So Saudi Arabia supporting terrorism, bad. Saudi Arabia carrying out a war in Yemen, bad. Things that Iran has done in supporting Assad, bad. Things the U.S. has done,
while you're doing it, you're saying the good and bad, Mr. Walsh. So let's check the good column in your perspective. Saudi Arabia, good at, please, fill in the blank.
So in this case, it would I'd say the main things are, from a U.S. interest perspective, it is a counterterrorism intelligence, management of the global oil supply, and the U.S. feels it's important to have some link to the Gulf states. It traditionally has had a link to either Iran, Saudi Arabia, or Iraq.
Okay.
So that's sort of the way things have been for a long time, for decades and decades. Just like Russia wants to be in Syria. That's their ally.
All right. Well, what about that, Mr. Ricard? Let's look at the column that has been checked good by Saudi Arabia, according to Mr. Walsh, and what actually that means for regional and global security.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say laughable. I mean, for God's sakes, he must be trying, Mr. Walsh must be trying to protect an endowment coming from Saudi Arabia to MIT or something. It's ridiculous. At the same time, at the end of the day, there is no positive on them managing the global oil supply, for God's sakes. That's just hilarious. At the end of the day, what this comes down to is he talks about, good and bad, for God's sakes. The Americans and the British have been doing tremendous damage to Iran for almost a century. The Americans funded and supported Saddam Hussein to rain down missiles upon Iran for almost a decade. Obviously Iran is being continuously basically attacked. Right now, they've just implemented additional sanctions on Iran for creating defensive weapons, conventional defensive weapons that they are allowed to create and allowed to protect themselves, for God's sakes. I mean, who would in their right mind would say this is an equal playing field when, in fact, Iran was attacked for 10 years by a United States ally and a United States equipment. And this is not something that Iran has done to anyone in centuries. So, to say that this is an even playing field and to try to defend it the way he's defending it, for sure, I think that Mr. Walsh is trying to defend some sort of his Saudi endowment funds going to MIT. I'd like to do some research on that myself.
Well, Mr. Walsh, looking at Saudi Arabia, and would you say that Saudi Arabia has been a stabilizing force in this region?
Well, I have to take a point of personal privilege, if I may. Your guest just made a personal attack on me and seemed to laugh about it while doing it.
Of course it is.
So he accuses me of taking money from Saudi Arabia and offers no evidence to that. And so from this point forward, I will not appear with him until he apologizes.
Find out.
After he does his research. But please do, and then I look forward to that on-air apology. As to your question about Saudi Arabia being a stabilizing force, it depends on what decade you're talking about. When the Shah ruled in Iran and when Saddam Hussein ruled in Iraq, back then, in those decades, the 70s, 80s, you had a rivalry between, just be quiet, you had a rivalry between Iraq and Iran. In that circumstance,
just be quiet.
Saudi Arabia was a balancing
Stay with me, Mr. Ricard. Go ahead,
supporting
Mr.
the
Walsh.
stronger party in some cases. So what Saudi Arabia did then, that's classically called balance of power. So it supported the weaker of the two whenever one of them looked like they were getting stronger. After 2003, Iraq essentially disappears as a Middle East player. And so the whole Saudi relationship in the Middle East changes once Saddam Hussein is toppled. And what we've had is a growing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I think it's caused violence, throughout the region. So my advice to my friends in the region, including my Iranian friends, is rather than taking every opportunity to pick at and make worse this rivalry, by propaganda or whatever, the governments really need to find a way to talk to one another and to turn down this rivalry, or the region will continue to be unstable. It's only when Saudis and Iranians begin to work out some of their problems that we can have any hope of bringing any sort of peace or stability to the region. So I hope that's what happens. The Saudis do things wrong all the time. I criticize them. The U.S. does things wrong all the time. I criticize them. Iran does things wrong all the time, and I criticize them. But at the end of the day, they have to be able to talk to each other.
Okay. Mr. Ricard, your take on all of this.
I lost connection. I can't hear a thing.
Mr. Okay.
Hey, Brian.
Unfortunately, we have I think we've lost the connection with Mr. Ricard in Tampa, and I'll just give this last question then.
I think they cut me off, or
Mr.
they have
Walsh?
an audio problem.
Mr. Walsh, can you hear me? Okay, we have lost both of our connections, unfortunately. I'd like to thank both my guests for being with us on this debate. Mr. Scott Ricord, former American intelligence linguist out of Tampa, Florida, and out of Boston, Mass. Mr. Jim Walsh from the Security Studies program at MIT. And as always, viewers, we thank you and being with us on another debate right here at Press TV. I'm Marzia Hashemi, thanking you for myself and all the crew coming right here to you out of Tehran, and hopefully we'll see you right here next time. Goodbye.